As we begin this course, it's really important to look at some visual principles and really some foundational concepts that are utilized throughout everything we do as graphic designers. These are the building blocks that really start our profession and really layer together to help us be effective visual communicators. Point, line, and plane are the building blocks of design. From these elements, designers can create images, icons, textures, patterns, diagrams, animations, and typographic systems. They're really everything that we do in design. They seem simple, but when you layer them together, they really are the thread between everything that we do and all of the ways that we communicate visually. A point marks a position in space. It takes the form of a dot. Through its scale, position, and relationship to its surroundings, a point can express its own identity or melt into a crowd. So here we're going to refer to circles as points. And these are really important aspects of design. They're something that we utilize extensively, not only just as a visual motif, but if you think even when you zoom in way deep into a photograph, it's actually made up of a series of many points of different colors that allow us to see an image. A series of points forms a line. A mass of points forms a texture, shape, or plane. Tiny points of varying size create shades of gray. In typography, the point is a period, the definitive end of a line. Here's some examples of points found in our environment. If you look around the space that you're in, you can probably see lots of points around you. In the on-campus class, we often send students out around the campus to find examples of points, and we find them in all kinds of places. An aerial view of a soda can, the center of a flower, right? The top of a light. These are all places where points exist, and as you really look, you'll start realizing that these building blocks of point, line, and plane are really all around us, and they create most of our visual environment. A line is an infinite series of points. A line has length. It can connect two points. Lines appear at the edges of objects and where two planes meet. So here we have an idea that if a point continues and repeats and repeats and repeats, it eventually creates length, which makes it into a line. When we have shapes as well, or planes, which we'll talk about next, the exterior edges of those planes are actually also examples of lines. And then we also have a hidden line on the right where these two planes or squares are butting up against each other but aren't quite touching. We end up with this invisible space, which is another example of a line. So you'll start realizing how all of these things are interconnected. Points, lines, and planes really work together and group together in different ways to create our visual environment and the world in graphic design. Lines are drawn with a brush, pen, pencil, mouse, or digital code. They can be straight or curved, continuous or broken. In typographic layouts, characters group to form lines of text. So there's a lot of visual qualities that these lines can take on that will express different things. So lines can be straight or curved, as we talked about. They can be broken. They can be drawn with a brush. They can be gloopy, blobby. They can be a line of text. And those all will give a different feeling. And using those different visual qualities really will change the way that your design is perceived and the way that it communicates with its viewer. Here's some examples of lines that were in the found environment. So wood grain on the upper right, or the spaces between bricks or concrete, are examples of line that we see in the visual world. A plane is a flat surface extending in height and width. A plane can be parallel to the picture surface, or it can skew and recede into space. So for the purpose of this project that you'll be doing, we're going to focus on three kinds of planes: triangles, circles, and squares. Those are the fundamental planes that we deal with, although there are other ones which you're probably familiar with, but those are the ones that we're going to focus on. And then on the right, you'll see that trapezoid, right? So that's a trapezoid shape, but also if you think about it, the way that the right and the left sides are converging together, it also creates the illusion of depth, right? It feels like potentially there is space being created. And that's another important consideration with planes, is that when they're combined together and we work with them, they can create an illusion of depth on a 2D surface. A plane can also be solid or perforated, opaque or transparent, textured or smooth. A field of text is a plane built from points and lines of type. So planes can also have a lot of qualities to them. Again, they can be transparent like we're seeing on the left. They can be filled with texture, which makes them feel different. And then also sometimes fields of text we sometimes would refer to as a plane. There's a rectangular sensibility or shape to that field of text that also makes it a plane, which also has its own feel of texture because it's filled with typography. And as we talked about earlier, a graphic object that includes a three-dimensional space has volume. It has height, width, and depth. The angle at which the elements recede reflects the position of the viewer. So depending on what angle you look at these objects at will depend how those planes are rendered and how it looks. But like I talked about with that trapezoid example, planes can also come together to create the illusion of depth. It can create the illusion of a 3D form like we're seeing with the ones that we're looking at here. So here's some examples of planes in our visual environment. So bricks, pillars, carpet blocks. Some of the lower right are panels in the roof of an elevator or the top of an elevator. So all examples of where we see planes, but you'll also notice that most of the places where you see these planes, there's some kind of lines that are defining those planes. So we're starting to see how line, point, and plane are all really connected in a very important way. But why are we doing point lines and planes? Why is this exercise a part of this course? I think oftentimes there's a question of, this is so basic, why are we focusing on this? But it's really, again, a building block that is used throughout all visual communication that we do as designers, but oftentimes it's something that we focus on. There are examples which I'll show where this is really the focus of the work that is being done, and it isn't all work. Sometimes it's just so complex and layered together that it's not something that you always see. Here's a great example. This is an invitation for an art and design degree show for Nottingham Trent University. This was done by Andrew Townsend. And you can see that all of the typography is filled with points, lines, and planes. It has a really wonderful color palette, which brings it to life. It has an interesting way that the invitation folds. It has these line illustrations. So this is all those building blocks that we're looking at, but twisted and done in a really unique way, which creates a really interesting and dynamic piece. Here's an example from the web. This is done by a studio called Bookmark in Spain, and it's a product school report. This is for 2022, so it's a website that is a report on different product management schools. But you can see that there's an emphasis here on different points and planes. In that first image on the left, there's planes and points being used. There's lines even in places where they're filling inside of those shapes. There's an infographic in the middle that's using points to really make that information come to life. And even on the far right, where the portraits of the people that are on this team are in points. So all of those elements are being used to create something that's really interesting and really dynamic and extremely cohesive. Here's a really fun example. This is by a Greek studio called Mouse Graphics. And this is actually adhesive for tile. So this is packaging of a powdered product that becomes a tile adhesive. And they've used a really wonderful fluorescent palette with all of these planes that layer together with a little bit of transparency to create something really dynamic and interesting. And besides the typography, this design is solely about those foundational concepts. It's really about planes. Here's another example also from Mouse Graphics. It's the same client. This is a sealant though this time, but it's using lines. So another example of how these basic building blocks can become really interesting and we use frequently in design. This is a musician's website done by Goodlove, and you can see that they're actually featuring all of these brightly colored planes that kind of dance and are scattered around this web page. Here's one actually for a designer. So this is Nick Bell. He's a designer out of the UK, and he's playing with point, line, and plane. He's done it in this fluorescent printing on his business cards and his different promotional materials for his personal identity system. But I think the color really makes this come to life. And I think it's also neat for this designer to really focus on this foundational concept and really make that the core of his identity. Here's another fun one. This is by Assembly, also in the UK. And it's a line of sheer stockings that were created called Paternity. And you'll notice the stockings on the left, there's this really fun use of lines, points, planes, and that's also reflected on the tube-like packaging that they come in. But here's another example of these building blocks, these very simple elements being used in interesting ways in contemporary graphic design. Here's another example of the web. This is Google Zoo. You're seeing the website on the left, where there's actually a use of points and planes in the logo, but then also that scrolling animation where the points and planes appear and sort of help that transition down the page. And on the right, you can see some of their business cards where they're also using points and planes as a motif on those cards. Although graphic designers frequently use typography in their work, they are also often required to communicate using visuals alone. This can be difficult at first, but a strong understanding of the principles of design and the emotional reactions they create can help you leverage these ideas to communicate more clearly and universally. This is really the core concept of this course. We have another course, Typography, where we're going to teach you a lot about communicating with words. This class is mostly about communicating without words. How do we communicate things when we do not have typography, that direct way to message the viewer? And so it's really important in this first assignment that we focus on how do we communicate? How do we make something feel chaotic? How do we make something feel calm? And what are the ways that we can manipulate the visuals that we use to create a certain aesthetic or feeling for the viewer? Balance in design is similar to balance in physics. A large shape close to the center can be balanced by a small shape close to the edge. Balance provides stability and structure to a design. It's the weight distributed in the design by the placement of your elements. So this is one of the concepts that we'll be looking at, balance. And that can be done in a lot of different ways. One is with symmetry. Symmetry is when the elements mirror from side to side along a common axis. Symmetry can be top to bottom, left to right, or both. Symmetrical balance can occur in any orientation as long as the image is the same weight or form on either side of the central axis. The result is formal, organized, and orderly, but it is sometimes easy to overemphasize the central axis. Sometimes these aren't as dynamic. Sometimes it's not going to create as interesting of a composition or a layout, although sometimes that's the goal. Sometimes you really want to create something that has that really orderly, organized, kind of formal look. Here we have some different examples. These are all using points where we have some symmetry. So you'll notice on the left, there's a symmetrical line running through horizontally of those three circles. In the middle, we have one that's running actually vertically. We have a little bit of scale variation in those as well. And then on the right, we have one that's symmetrical on a diagonal axis. So these are different ways that we create symmetry. And these are all good examples of symmetrical layouts using only points, and very similar to what you'll be doing on this actual project. You'll be working with points, lines, and planes to communicate different concepts, and symmetry is one of those concepts. Here's the Taj Mahal, a great example of a piece of architecture that is completely symmetrical. This makes sense. This creates a very formal, orderly piece of architecture. This is in India. It's very beautiful in the way that the entire building is symmetrical. If you look, the towers are all equidistant on each side. The windows, the placement of everything is mirrored from one side to the other, creating a very beautiful piece of symmetrical architecture. Here's another example of symmetry. This is by Sadie Redwing. She's a Lakota and Dakota designer, and this was a visual essay that she created depicting her journey through North Carolina State. And you'll notice that there's a lot of symbolism being used here, which is shown in the middle, but also there's a use of symmetry to reflect that design and have it cover the entire poster. So it's a really interesting strategy where one quadrant or corner of this poster is being created and then it's reflected and repeated to create this really beautiful design that really articulates what her journey was like as she went through college. Here's another example of symmetry. This is a Nigerian coffee house, Umutu Coffee Company. This was designed by Anagrama. They're a studio that has offices in Mexico, but also New York. But you can see there's so much symmetry at play here. Not only is the logo perfectly symmetrical, well, almost perfectly symmetrical. You'll see that little O for the co that kind of breaks the symmetry slightly, but they've really gone for a very formal approach in this symmetrical logo. You can also see that this entire carrier is symmetrical as well, right? The placement of the cups, the placement of the hole in the center, the centering of the logo. There's a lot of use of formal symmetry here that's creating a certain feeling for the viewer. Here's one more on the web. This is a piece by Kevin Cantrell. He's a Salt Lake City designer, and this is for an Argentinian hotel called Villa Baluna. And you'll notice that he is using symmetry in a similar way to Sadie Redwing, where there's a reflecting of these patterns that are being placed around these illustrations that are creating a seamless pattern, but that's really symmetrical. And that's advantageous in a lot of ways. One, it allows you to create one part of the design and then repeat it, but it also gives, again, a little bit more of a formal feeling, which is really useful in this design. The iPad example of this as well is also especially symmetrical. You'll notice the way the menu and the book, both of those buttons or links at the top, are perfectly on either side. The way everything else is centered is creating a very symmetrical layout. Asymmetry is another form of balance, and that's when elements are placed organically, relying on the interaction of form and negative space to yield tension and balance. These are typically a little bit more active. They're going to create a more dynamic kind of layout or composition, because asymmetrical balance means balance without symmetry. So there's no symmetry at all. It is possible to achieve balance without symmetry, so the placement of elements of varying visual weight will balance one another around a fulcrum point. You can use asymmetry to draw attention to a certain part of a design and also create visual interest. So here's some asymmetrical compositions. Again, just using points. None of these are symmetrical. Some of them are playing with scale, some of them are not. But there's no axis that you can draw through these compositions that will create that mirroring effect, that symmetrical look. Here's a piece of asymmetrical architecture. This is a building by Santiago Calatrava. He's a Spanish architect. This is the Tenerife Opera House on the Canary Islands. And you can see this beautiful asymmetry, right? There's this kind of cantilevered roof that comes over the top of the building that comes to a point that's asymmetrical, that's really making this building very dynamic. It feels very active, right? As opposed to the Taj Mahal, which felt more formal, felt more grounded, right? This almost feels like it's in flight or in motion, which is something you frequently see in asymmetry. Here's an example of asymmetry on a book cover. This is by Silas Monroe. He works at a studio called Polymode, and this is for Strike Through, which is a wonderful book about protest graphics. But you'll notice the way that the typography for Strike Through and typographic messages of protest is all pushed to the right-hand side. It's also on a slight angle, creating an asymmetrical layout. It's also referencing or visually playing with the fist that's on this cover. So there's a nice relationship between type and image here as well, but a great example of an asymmetrical design. Here's some work by Marcos Key. They're a design firm out of New York City, and this is for M7, which is a design and fashion innovation hub in Qatar. And you'll see all of these really are focusing on asymmetry, particularly the middle and the right. You could argue that the one on the left has symmetrical components to it, but the one on the middle and the right are a little bit more dynamic. They're playing with an angle in the middle. They're creating these asymmetrical layouts, which are a little bit more interesting. Here's a little bit of asymmetry on the web. This is a KFC website redesign project by Basic. They're a local design firm here in San Diego. And it's really interesting how you have this asymmetrical hero image. We have the type on the left, and then we have that phone graphic on the right that's not perfectly centered. They're really creating something that's more dynamic, something that's more asymmetrical. Another concept we want to look at is rhythm. Rhythm is the repetition or alternation of elements, often with defined intervals between them. Rhythm can create a sense of movement and can establish pattern and texture. This is another tool we use to communicate visually to the viewer by creating different kinds of rhythm. There are many different kinds of rhythm, often defined by the feeling something evokes when viewed. Repeating visual elements such as line, color, shape, texture, value, or image tends to unify the total effect of a work of art as well as create rhythm. Regular rhythm occurs when the intervals between the elements and often the elements themselves are similar in size or length. So here you're looking at a very regular rhythm. These planes or these squares that are repeating are all done in a grid-like structure that repeat at the same interval and creates a regular rhythm. A good example of that would be this vitamin water packaging. Although they're different colors and some of the typography on these are different, there's a regular rhythm that's being used in the way that this label is split and divided. It's always divided in the same place, and it creates a system that has regular rhythm. A flowing rhythm gives a sense of movement and is often more organic in nature. So here we've taken those same planes or squares and we've sort of moved them to create this sense of a flowing rhythm. It sort of undulates and goes up and down in a way that creates a more organic feeling. And sometimes that can be a useful rhythm to use in your design. Here's an example of more of a flowing rhythm. Again, vitamin water again. This is from Collins. They're a design studio in the United States, and they did a refresh for vitamin water. They didn't design the packaging that we looked at, but they designed some graphics including this advertisement. And here they're rotating that iconic package with that interesting regular rhythm, and they're flipping it to create more of a flowing rhythm, which makes something a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more interesting. Here's another piece with flowing rhythm. This is Hear, See, Play. It's an exhibit about designing with sound that was at the Cooper Hewitt. This is also done by Marcos Key. And at the bottom, it's showing record covers designed by Joseph Albers for Command Records. And you can see here how Albers is really playing with the placement and the proximity of these points and planes to create a sense of rhythm, right? He's creating a sense of rhythm, which is really important to music and sound. So for designing these record covers, it's important that he uses these really simple motifs or graphics, but gives them energy and gives them a sense of flowing rhythm that makes us think of music and percussion. A progressive rhythm shows a sequence of forms through a progression of steps. So here we have fewer planes or squares, but they're moving and slightly rotating to create a feeling that it's lifting up, maybe like a plane taking off. So sometimes when we show rhythm like this and it changes at the same interval over and over, we actually create what we call a progressive rhythm, where it feels like something's happening. There's a progression that's occurring in the design. So one interesting example of this is Saul Bass. He's a famous American graphic designer who created a lot of title sequences. And here's an animation of the title sequence he did for Man with the Golden Arm. So motion graphics that are meant to move like this always need to have a sense of rhythm and really progressive rhythm, right? These lines come together, they move in the same way and combine in an interesting way to create this arm. And it's really the series of those steps that creates the motion, that creates the story that's being built here. It's a little bit like when you maybe have made a flip book and you flip through all those pages, and as that rhythm continues and that progressive rhythm happens, a story is told. Those images come together and create almost a little movie. And that's a lot of what's going on here with Saul Bass's title sequence work. Repetition is reusing an element or process to create a relationship or strengthen the unity, order, and balance of a composition. So repetition is a really useful tool we use in design because it helps us create order. It helps us do something more quickly by repeating it, or maybe it helps us send a signal to the viewer that things are related to each other. So again, that vitamin water packaging is a wonderful example, right? It has a regular rhythm, but also the repetition of the way these labels are built helps us know that these are all a part of the same packaging system. So the way that, again, that color blocking is divided always in the same way, the way that the typography is always in the same place and in the same typeface, that repetition creates a system that is really valuable for us as consumers to know that this is one line of products. Here's another example of repetition, but used in a different way, much more dynamic way. This is, again, work from Polymode Studio, which is owned by Silas Monroe. This is for the Industry LA Opera. So this is a music organization in Los Angeles, but you can see how they've taken the type and they've repeated it, but they've outlined it. And then they're actually twisting it, right? They're kind of rotating and moving it to give it motion, to give it a little bit of a dynamic feeling. And this use of repetition here is actually making us think of music. It's creating an interesting rhythm in the way that those letters are actually becoming lines and rotating to create something really dynamic. This is some work from Michael Beirut. He's a partner at Pentagram, which is an international design agency. He works in New York City. And this is work for Mohawk, which is a paper company. And what's interesting is a part of that rebrand, he created this modular system where the symbol for the logo itself, which you can see almost the entire thing on the far right in black and white, that thing can actually split up and repeat to create patterns. So here we're actually using repetition to create these really interesting patterns, which becomes a very core component of the Mohawk brand. Creates a lot of interest for the brand. It's a way to build brand equity by reusing the logo in different colors and different ways to make it really interesting for the user and the consumer. Unity creates a feeling of wholeness. Unity is usually achieved when the parts complement each other in a way where they have something in common. Unity can be achieved by the use of the same color or different tints of it, or maybe using a similar graphic style for illustrations. So Unity is another really powerful tool that sometimes is used in conjunction with repetition. Sometimes repetition is what creates unity, but it really allows us to, again, send signals to the viewer that things are related. It helps us create things that feel cohesive. So here's some magazine covers. This is a magazine called Monocle. It's a magazine out of the United Kingdom, and they have a very strict cover story that they tell. You'll notice that the type is always in the same place. The image is always the same shape. So there's like a very strict system being created here that creates a strong amount of unity, where you could maybe almost create the next cover by looking at one of these, right? But also as a viewer, if you went to a newsstand and were looking for this magazine, you have a really easy time finding it because of what a strong approach they take in terms of unity to how they build these covers. The only difference really between these is not only the imagery themselves and what the type actually says, but also the middle one, you'll notice, has that yellow band at the top. So there's one small place where they've sort of broken that system and changed the way the Unity works. But you could still make a strong case that these are a very unified system of covers. And editorial design, where we design books and magazines, is a place where we really often see Unity used because it really helps the reader understand that they're looking at the same magazine and that they're related to each other. Here's another interesting way to use Unity. These are book covers for Oliver Sacks. These are done by Carden Webb, who is a New York City-based book designer. But not only do we have unity in terms of the way that Oliver Sacks' name is appearing, it appears almost the same way each time. It sometimes moves to the bottom from the top. So there is some breaking of that system. But what I really find interesting about this example is the way that the covers actually connect together. So if you have all 6 of these books, they actually connect in an interesting way where that image of the skull or the human head and the brain appears in the background. So there's unity being used here as well in the way that these covers can connect together to create this larger image. Unity is something we often use in branding as well, or the creation of logos and systems for how companies represent themselves. This is some work from Chermayeff, Geismar, and Haviv. This is the stationery system for Showtime, which is a television network on cable. And you'll notice that the logo always appears more or less in the same place, in the same color. It's almost the exact same size each time. The same typefaces are being used. And this allows Showtime to have a unified system in how they represent themselves. It allows them to feel more professional, right? If all of their materials are very similar in the way that they're presented and they look like a cohesive system. Here's another interesting one. This is where someone has actually taken objects and unified them together, right? So we have all these objects and they're almost evenly spaced. They fit together in this beautiful way, and they all fit together into this large rectangular shape. We sometimes refer to this as knolling. This is a term that was coined by Andrew Cromolo, who is actually someone who worked in Frank Gehry's studio. He's a famous architect from the United States. And when he would clean up the studio, he was their janitor, he would often take the tools that were left out and kind of organize them in a similar way to this. And it was something that he created and we see a lot in design, and it really references Knoll, the furniture company, and some of their angular designs. And so sometimes we refer to this as knolling, but it's another way that we create unity, by the way that we curate or combine or lay out objects. We can make them feel like they go together even if they're very different because of the way that they're presented together. Order is a system or arrangement that has been directed, an organizational structure that creates a rationale for decisions. So order is very much related to unity. It's also related to repetition in some ways, because sometimes repetition, again, is used to create unity, and repetition and unity can be used to create order. But it really allows us to have a reason for what we do and how we create things. And it really helps us have a rationale for our decisions to make sure that we're communicating in the best way possible. So here's an example of a project by Center Design. They're in Brooklyn, and this is Catkin. It's actually cat food that they created. And you can see this strong use of order in the way that this packaging was created. On the right, you can see all of the different flavors, right? Or the different food products that are included in the different kinds of cat food. But there's a strong system being used. The color changes and the typography changes. A little bit similar to that vitamin water packaging. We see this a lot in packaging, but order is really being used to create this strong system so that us as a viewer can differentiate the difference between the oink and the gobble, but also so that we know that this is all the same brand of cat food. Here's another piece from Basic, the San Diego-based interactive studio, and this is their Patagonia design system. So oftentimes companies will have massive design systems that they utilize, and this is one for their website. And you can see that this really determines the colors that are used, the typefaces that are used, the different shapes that they use on the web, the icon system, how things will look so that as they build out this massive e-commerce website, there's strong unity between all of it so us as a viewer can see the order, see the organization, so that we can really navigate their site in an effective way to find what we're looking for. Scale is the associations of size related to a constant size, unit of measure, or relative whole, such as the human body or a picture plane. It's really the size of something, the dimensional element defined by other elements of design, size relative to art, its surroundings, or in relation to humans. Scale is the size of an element as it relates to its usual physical size. So really we're talking about size here, but scale is an interesting concept because scale really is useful for communication and design when we're looking at the scale of something related to something else, right? That can sometimes really help us understand how big something is. Think of maybe sometimes when you see things on the internet and it's hard to judge how big it is. They might put a quarter next to it or something that's a common size that we all know so we understand how large or small something is. So it's not just about the size of something, it's also about the size in relationship to something else that really can be useful to us as designers. We see this a lot in information graphics. This is an infographic of world populations. This is created from some UN data projections for 2023, and it was done by David McCandless, who runs a blog called Information is Beautiful. But you can see that there's color being used here, which is useful. Down at the bottom, it's showing the different continents. But then scale is being used to help you see how much bigger China is than Japan, Vietnam, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, right? The size of the shape that China is taking up really helps us understand how much larger it is than these other countries. And so scale is being used here in a relative way so that we can see the relationships between the different populations around the globe. Here's another piece from Sadie Redwing. It's a World Policy Journal cover where we're also using scale, but here scale is being used to navigate us as the viewer. So here what's going on is actually scale is being used to guide us around this design. So World Policy Journal is the largest, so that draws us in first. That really helps us know what we're looking at. This is the title of this journal or this magazine. Then we have headlines that are running around, that circle in the middle, as well as some headlines at the bottom that tell us some of the information that's going to be in this journal. That really is what we refer to as hierarchy. And that use of scale here is creating hierarchy that helps us read this in the correct order so we really understand what we're looking at. Scale is also really interesting in that it can also be used in terms of how much space we have. This happens a lot when we work on interactive projects, so websites, apps, things that happen on digital screens. But here's more work from Basic. This is their Patagonia project again, but here we're looking at their responsive solution, where we're looking at how design fits into the physical scale of a screen. So how do we take a website that might be on a large monitor and shrink it down and actually make it fit on a smaller size phone? The other challenge when we're looking at interactive media or things that happen on screens is that there are almost an infinite number of sizes that we're dealing with. So we need to make something that we refer to as responsive, which means that it can fit in almost any environment and still be successful for the viewer. Emphasis is where an element or elements within a composition contain a hierarchy of visual importance. So emphasis is related to scale. Oftentimes scale is the way that we create emphasis, like in this example here. Here's some simple typography, but by using scale, we're really allowing you to look at that middle line first, then the line above it, and then finally down at that smaller line at the bottom. And it's that combination of scale that really allows you to read this in the right order, very similar to that World Policy Journal example that we looked at. But sometimes we create emphasis in other ways too. Here's a website created by Myers Ball. They're a local agency here in San Diego, and it's a website for PlantKiss. And here they're using color to create emphasis. You'll notice that there's a bright orange color that's used throughout this website, very sparingly, but it is used, and it's used to draw you through what we call the CTAs, or the call to actions. They're always going to be the shop now buttons, the learn more buttons, right? It's where it's going to attract your attention to convert you as a consumer to hopefully buy or add to your cart what we're looking at and what they're selling on this website. So here, color is really being used as a tool of emphasis. Here's another example of scale being used to create emphasis or hierarchy. This is signage for Fit Athletics by Hollis. Hollis Brand Culture is a local agency that does a lot of environmental graphics. So they really focus on creating graphics for our environments, which includes signage like this. But you can see that there's a really nice system being created on this sign on the right, where the number is the largest, right? That really tells you what floor you're on. And then below, there's smaller scale typography that tells you what is happening on that floor. And then even below that is some information that's a little less important than that, that's even smaller, that drives you to that as the third thing in the hierarchy. Positive negative space is one of the building blocks of design. It's a very powerful tool. Positive space is the shapes of an object such as text and graphics. So on this page, the positive space would be the actual navy blue words that you are looking at, where negative space, or known as white space, are the shapes around the object. So everything around and inside of that typography would actually be considered the negative space in this case. So it's a really important relationship that we play with a lot. It's a really important concept to understand. Sometimes it's that we just want to create dynamic, interesting compositions where the white space or the negative space on a page becomes really interesting and pleasing. But sometimes we do other things with positive, negative space that can create more meaning as well. This is a great example of that. This is the FedEx logo, which you are probably familiar with. This was done by Landor, which is now called Landor and Fitch. And it was designed in 1994 by Lyndon Leader. So here we have a really interesting positive, negative solution for a logo because there's an arrow actually hidden in this logo. Between the E and the X is a right-facing arrow that's created in the negative space of that text. And that's very intentional. It's a part of the concept of this logo because they really want to send a message that they are moving forward. They're forward thinking, right? They're also moving your packages and moving you and your goods around the world. So it's a very clever example of positive negative space where we're using that to create more meaning. Here's another really interesting example. This is the work of Noma Bar. He's an illustrator based in London and does very simple illustrations in a very flat style, but they're usually very conceptual. They really have extra meaning that's created from the use of positive negative space. So these are all posters for IBM. The one on the left is for a story where IBM helped rural schools in Pike County, Kentucky access a first-class education. So they're using that fountain pen to represent education, but then going through the middle of it to create the split in the fountain pen is that USB cord. So it's that relationship between education and technology. The one in the middle was where IBM helped retailers in Canada and Norway track food from farm to fork. So it was a process of tracking food. So there's kind of this play where the mouth and the chicken are being shared, right? Which is really hinting at this idea of tracking food all the way to the final consumer when it's actually consumed. And then on the right is one where IBM helped drivers see traffic jams before they would happen in Singapore. So there's kind of this binoculars being used where you're seeing something maybe from far away, implying that you're seeing it happen early on, but those binoculars are also the wheels of that car. So there's a double play here that's happening with positive and negative space. Like the FedEx logo, we often see positive, negative space used in logos. It's often a strategy that we use because it can create a lot of meaning and is really powerful. So on the left is a logo by Pentagram for the American Institute of Architects Center, where we have a key, but the key actually, instead of those normal teeth, it's actually buildings. Or the middle one is really interesting. This is by Alan Peters. He's an American graphic designer. This is Firecraft Pizza. So it's a piece of fire, but it's also a pizza at the same time, which really hints at the way that pizza is produced. Also lets you know a little bit about the quality, that it's probably made on site. Or the one on the far right, which is an older example. This is from Vanderbilt University. It was done by Malcolm Greer Design, where the actual middle part of the V is replaced by this leaf, which is an important symbol for this university. Illusion is simulating or inventing using graphic design to create something that's not there. So again, related to positive, negative space, there's a reason why we've sequenced these things together, but illusion is a very specific way of sometimes using positive, negative space, or a way of manipulating visuals to create, again, something that's not actually on the page. So on the left here is an interesting typeface by Fred Johnson. He's a designer out of Portland, Oregon, and it's called Implausible. So it's actually a typeface that could never really exist, right? The way the lines come together, there's this bending of space in a way that is not real and creates this interesting illusion, right? And it's why it's partly called implausible. And then I have that Noma bar example again from IBM, right? And something that would never happen in real life. A USB cord could never be the middle of a fountain pen. I mean, you could make the illusion, or you could produce a fountain pen that would look like this, but this would never actually happen, and that illusion is creating a lot of meaning. It's another really fun example. This is Simon Morden's science fiction novels from Orbit Books, and there's these black and white patterns that are being used on the covers that are really neat and create different illusions. So some of them are optical illusions that are kind of messing with your mind and the way you perceive them. But if you really look at the one on the far left, it's especially interesting because there's actually type hidden in there. It actually says mind the gap. So there's a way that they're manipulating those concentric black lines that are creating those circles to actually, if you kind of squint, you'll be able to see it say mind the gap. So here they're playing with optical illusions, which is a really interesting strategy in design and an interesting use of the idea of illusion. But the one in the middle and the right, those dots, the way that they're kind of receding and changing in shape is making it feel almost like there's a fluidity to that. So it's another way that they're creating illusion. Space is the format or amount of area the design contains. The placement of objects in this structure can emphasize or de-emphasize this area. It can also refer to the graphic's ability to overlap and portray depth. So space is another interesting tool. Sometimes it's used to create illusion, but it can just be the actual area that we have to design in. So if you're designing a magazine and it's 8.5 by 11, that is the space that you're working with. That is the format. So you can play with that space and activate it in different ways by the ways that you create your composition on that format itself. But sometimes we can also use space to create an overlap or create a perception of depth. So here are some logos where we're actually looking at that concept of creating depth or creating a sense of overlap. On the far left is the Tiffany & Company logo, which is a high-end jewelry brand. And this logo was done by Louis Philippe, and you'll see that we have what we call a monogram, which is a combining of multiple letter forms together. So we have the T, the C, the O, and then the and symbol, which we call an ampersand. So what's interesting is there's little white lines around the overlaps of these different letter forms that are making them feel like they weave together. So if you look at the top of the ampersand, there's lines on either side of the T, which makes it feel like it goes behind. But then if you look in the middle of that ampersand where it comes across the T again, there's other lines that make it feel like it's coming on top. So there's a sense of depth being created here, which is really successful for this piece. Another example will be the Netflix logo. This was done by Gretel, a New York City agency, but you'll notice that they're using color here to create depth. So that middle diagonal stroke on the end feels like it's coming forward because it's a brighter red color. And also there's a little shading around it that makes it feel like those vertical lines are actually more behind it. So it's giving a 3D element of space just by using color. But sometimes we do it just by shapes. The one on the right is actually a Canadian logo for a space organization, but they're using scale to make it feel like those circles are coming forward. So they're creating a sense of space just from the scale of the shapes themselves, which might be something that you explore on this assignment. Here's a piece from Ann Walsh. That's a agency out in New York City. And this is for Appy Fizz. This is a beverage that they created. But what I love is this advertisement they created in the environment that they put the product in, right? All of these circles are surrounding these 3D spheres, right? But they're not really 3D. We're just seeing it that way because of the way that those circles are being manipulated to create a sense that these are on these 3D objects. So another way that we're using space. Tension is created through a lack of harmony and balance. It often involves trapped spaces or items that create an uneasiness for the viewer. So tension is an interesting concept. It's something that we use sparingly, but can be really valuable. And it's something that you really want to pay attention to because sometimes you really want to create tension in your piece. Or maybe you want to attract the attention to a certain part of your composition by using tension. So here's two examples of that. The left is a poster for Phoebe Bridgers by Jason Munn. And you'll see that there's a lot of tension being created just through these simple lines. The way that they don't line up, right? They perfectly don't line up. They're actually alternating. And that alternating creates this almost like invisible line that runs vertically through the middle of that composition and creates a lot of tension. Sometimes tension can be a little bit uncomfortable, and that's done intentionally. And that's a little bit of what's happening here. Or on the right is a piece from John Massey. It's a poster to celebrate the 500th year of Nicholas Copernicus, who is a famous Polish scientist. But the way that there's this red circle trapped between these two larger kind of monoliths on either side is creating a lot of tension. So sometimes tension is created by trapping something in a space. Here's another example of some tension. This is a utility guide for French paper company. And what's interesting here is the tension is being done in an interesting way, and that there's a little bit of an off registration to this design. So if you look, the color field that would fill the illustration is a little bit off from the actual outline of it. And that's an interesting technique we sometimes see in illustration, and it's done on purpose here to create a little bit of tension. It's also creating a little bit of interest in this piece. So it's kind of cool, that off registration that's happening between the outlines of these illustrations and then the colored fills that go inside of them. Chaos is also created through a lack of harmony and balance, similar to tension. It frequently disregards common design conventions, often creating a composition that's difficult for the viewer to look at or understand. But sometimes that's our goal. Sometimes creating chaos is the effect or the visual that we want to create. Sometimes that's what's really appropriate for the design that we're building. One example of chaos would be this work for Raygun magazine created by David Carson and Chris Ashworth. This was work that was done in the 90s during a grunge era of design that we often refer to as deconstruction. But there's an intentional chaos here. The type is not always on the same baseline. It's skewed. It's not lining up. Some of it's hard to read. Some of it's cut and imperfect. And so there's an intentional aesthetic being created here by using chaos, by breaking a lot of the conventions and rules of design to create a chaotic layout. So sometimes chaos can be created just by sort of instinctually making something and sort of making it messy, making it imperfect, making it not have symmetrical, formal kind of organizational structure can be a great way to create chaos. Here's a piece from Aesthetic Apparatus. They're a design firm out of Texas. And here we're seeing, again, chaos being created, but in a little bit of a more restrained way. The way that they're rotating the lines of text in that headline creates a little bit of chaos, but then also the illustration itself. The heavy use of texture, the way they're rendering that illustration has a chaotic sense to it. Here's another fun one. This is from Wedge. They're a design studio in Los Angeles and Montreal, and this is their Amy wine packaging, which is really fun. There's a chaotic component being used here. Maybe not as chaotic as the other things that we've looked at, but there's these half circles that are sort of balancing on each other and kind of stacked in a really nonsensical way. I love the side panel that you'll see third from the left, where there's kind of this geometric guy kind of balancing and holding the QR code and the recycling code and all of the different components. So there's a chaotic element being used here. There's also a layering that's creating a little bit of chaos, the way that colors are being layered on top of each other. There's almost this monochromatic palette in the background and then black that's being layered on top that creates a little bit of chaos. So a good example of how we use chaos in a more restrained way, although sometimes that's not the goal. Sometimes the goal is to create a very chaotic layout intentionally. So this is a good example of an interesting use of chaos that maybe is a little bit more straightforward. So that gets us to what you'll be doing. We're going to be working for the first few weeks on the Visual Principles assignment. And that is really taking point, line, and plane and communicating different words. And this is really valuable, again, because we really want to practice nonverbal communication. How do we make something feel chaotic? How do we make something feel calm? That's going to be a core of everything that you do as a designer. And so by focusing on this in isolation, it'll really help you understand these concepts. So in a series of exercises using Adobe Illustrator, you will work with points, lines, and planes in square compositions. You must use 7 or less of the same shape to communicate the design concept description listed below each square. There is a video in the learning module where you can learn how to make these basic shapes and work with masking layers and understanding how the file is built. There's also a template that you'll be using for this. So there's a software tutorial that goes along with this that will help support you on the actual execution of this assignment. But where we're actually going to start is with sketching. We're going to be doing some sketching of these concepts so that you can start picking out ideas and understanding how you can communicate these things before we actually execute them in the computer. So these are some sketches from a former student. You'll see on the upper left is symmetry, and right there we're looking at planes. So different ways to create symmetry using planes. Below there are different ways of creating symmetry using points. And then below that is different ways of creating symmetry using lines. So you're going to explore each of the different shapes with each of these different words. So the next set on that page on the left is asymmetry. So again, we have asymmetry with planes, asymmetry with points, asymmetry with line. And these will get your juices flowing. This will help you get ideas. It'll help you practice communicating these things before we pick 2 of each combination that you'll use for the final. So for the final, there'll be 2 symmetry that are line, 2 symmetry that are point, and 2 symmetry that are plane. So that's really going to help us ensure that we're exploring, we're getting different ideas, and in the end, we're finding the best idea to execute in Illustrator. And then you'll take these into Illustrator, and you'll take your sketch and translate it into the templates that are provided. And that doesn't mean you can't change them a little bit, but for the most part, we're hoping to stick to the way those sketches look. So here's 2 examples. These are both of symmetry and point. Here's another set with asymmetry and line. Here's a set that's showing rhythm using planes. Here's some that show repetition using lines. This is unity using planes. So you can see that unity and how these are using unity to create an organizational structure. So these are just examples to get your ideas flowing so you can see a little bit of what are we actually working on, what's the end product on this assignment. Here's order using points. Here's some scale using lines. And then some emphasis with points. So really interesting. They're using emphasis in different ways. The one on the left is creating emphasis through the placement or the proximity, or the one on the right is using emphasis through scale. Here's positive, negative space using planes. Here's space using points. Here's some tension being created through lines. And then some chaos being created through planes. So that is your task. You'll be working on some sketches, and then ultimately you'll be translating all of these into Illustrator. So this should just give you some ideas of where we're going, what we're going to be working on, and what's the assignment that we'll be doing for the first few weeks in this class. And you are always welcome to write your instructor. They're here to help you, guide you along the way. But don't forget that there's also a video that goes along with this that will walk you through the software and the actual execution of this assignment. So good luck, and I hope you enjoy learning more about communicating visually without words through these simple shapes.